My name is Rachel Dawson, and at 28 years old, I had reached what most officers twice my age only dreamed of. The Navy had placed captain's bars on my shoulders that morning, a promotion in naval intelligence so rare at my age it drew whispers in corridors. The evening was meant to be a celebration, a small dinner in the house where I had grown up hiding bruises and swallowing silence. My mother Linda set the table with trembling hands, polishing silverware that caught the light like cold mirrors. Colonel Michael Granger, a man whose presence could silence an entire room without raising his voice, had agreed to attend. His attendance made the dinner more than family. It made it official. It made it dangerous. My stepfather, Harold Dawson, was 55, a retired officer whose career had collapsed under mediocrity and drink. He wore bitterness like a second uniform. Veterans' benefits kept his pride barely alive, and he despised the very idea that his stepdaughter had surpassed everything he had failed to be. That night his laugh was too loud, his wine glass never empty. He paraded false war stories across the table, exaggerations and lies that bounced hollow against the colonel's steady silence. I watched him from the corner of my eye. He was failing to impress, and I knew what failure meant in this house. When the colonel turned to me with quiet curiosity and asked what I did, Harold's hand snapped up like a barrier. "She is just a girl with her nose in books," he sneered. "Nothing to waste your attention on, sir." The words should have buried me back into invisibility, but instead, the colonel studied me. His head tilted ever so slightly. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had seen the name R. Dawson before on tactical reports and simulation records that had solved problems his staff could not. In that instant, Harold sensed it too, though he could not name it. His smirk stiffened. The illusion of dominance he lived on began to crack, and then he snapped. The blow came across the table with terrifying speed. His fist drove into my chest, a brutal strike that crushed into bone. I heard the sound before I felt it, a sharp crack like a branch splitting in winter. Pain tore through my ribs. My breath vanished. The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate, the metallic echo cutting through the stunned silence. My mother gasped, then swallowed the sound back down, as if afraid even her breath might invite another strike. The world narrowed to the throb of shattered ribs, the smear of wine spilling across the white tablecloth, the taste of copper rising in my throat. Harold leaned back, smirk curling again, confident that the room would fold into the same silence it always had. He believed violence was final, that no one ever challenged him once the fist landed. He believed wrong. Colonel Granger stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded like a blade drawn from a sheath. His voice was not loud, yet it carried the weight of command forged in decades of battlefields. "She is already a captain on track to Admiral. You just assaulted a United States officer at an official event. Military police arrest him now." The words struck harder than Harold's fist. The front door opened with precision. 2 MPs stepped in boots, hitting the floor in rhythm. Their presence no accident. The colonel had ordered them to wait outside before dinner even began. Harold's smirk collapsed. Color drained from his face. For the first time in my life, I watched him cornered, not in control, not feared, but exposed. My chest burned with every shallow breath, yet inside me, something ignited stronger than pain. The silence he had ruled with was gone. The tribunal had begun, and Harold Dawson would never escape it. From the outside, no one would have guessed that my life split into 2 worlds. At home, I was the stepdaughter who kept her head down, who cleared plates without speaking, who pretended not to hear when Harold barked orders that had no weight beyond the walls of our house. But outside those walls in the uniform I kept hidden from him, I carried the weight of secrets that shaped national security. That contrast was not accidental. It was survival. I enlisted as soon as I was old enough, driven not by dreams of glory, but by the need for structure, for rules that were not arbitrary, for a world where rank was earned through skill and not through fear. The Navy gave me what Harold never did. In the barracks, I was not invisible. In intelligence classrooms, surrounded by officers skeptical of someone my age, I earned attention not through defiance, but through results. Equations, maps, battle reports. The pieces fell into patterns I could not unsee. The instructors thought they were testing me. They did not realize I had spent years decoding the unpredictable moods of a violent man. Once you learn to survive chaos at home, predicting formations on a battlefield feels almost logical. By 22, I was already in rooms I was not supposed to enter. My superior slid simulations in front of me that seasoned officers had failed to solve. I saw vulnerabilities in minutes, strategies unfolding like puzzles I had rehearsed since childhood. Reports began to circulate with my initials at the bottom R. Dawson, the signature of someone they called a prodigy, though I never thought of myself as one. To me, it was just survival given another form. Still, every evening I walked through the same front door into a house where none of that mattered. My mother would glance up briefly, eyes darting between me and Harold as if to warn me not to draw attention. Harold would sit in his chair, a beer balanced on one armrest, recounting again how he would have made colonel if not for politics. He never noticed the weight of my duffel bag, never asked where I had been, never questioned why I disappeared for days at a time. He did not care enough to see. That ignorance was both my shield and my prison. I kept my uniform sealed in garment bags buried behind civilian clothes. Medals stayed tucked away in drawers he never opened. My work laptop never crossed the threshold. It was easier to let him believe I was still just a quiet girl, too timid to live beyond books. If he ever saw how far I had climbed, his pride would have turned to rage and his fists would have followed. So I built walls between identities. At the dinner table, I nodded when he spoke. In intelligence briefings, I issued orders to officers twice my age. No one connected the two lives, and I convinced myself they never would. The cost of that secrecy was exhaustion. I learned to split myself in two, to hold brilliance in one hand and silence in the other. Nights when others celebrated victories, I sat awake studying maps until lines blurred, whispering to myself the same mantra I had repeated since childhood. Endure. Anticipate. Do not break. I trained my face not to flinch, my voice, not to tremble my body, not to show strain. To the Navy, it looked like discipline. To me, it was the only language I had ever known. By 25, my reports were shaping fleet movements. Commanders quoted strategies they thought were their own, but were lifted word for word from pages I had drafted. It did not matter that my name was erased. Lives were saved. Crises averted. That was enough. The irony was that the man who belittled me most never noticed that superiors he envied came to our house and asked for me by name. When officers visited, Harold assumed they were old family friends. He poured drinks and bragged about campaigns he never fought. They humored him. They looked past him. They looked at me, and I nodded, politely answered briefly, then slipped back into invisibility the moment I could. The divide grew sharper each year. On base, sailors stood when I entered. At home, Harold snapped his fingers for me to bring him another beer. In war rooms, admirals leaned over my diagrams, tracing the paths I had marked. At home, Harold slammed doors to prove he still had power. The dissonance was staggering, but I carried it because I had no choice. If endurance had been my survival tool as a child, secrecy became my shield as an adult. What Harold never understood, what my mother feared to acknowledge, was that silence can be more dangerous than noise. For years, he thought my quiet meant weakness. He thought the absence of argument meant surrender. He never realized silence was where I sharpened myself, where I built patience like armor, where I hid the mind that would eventually unravel him. Every bruise he left on me became another layer of discipline. Every insult carved deeper into the resolve that drove me through late nights in intelligence labs. He had forged me without knowing it, but not into what he wanted. He had built not obedience but resistance, not submission but strength. And while he still sat in that living room polishing the remnants of a career that had long since rusted, I was already moving faster than he could imagine. The tragedy of Harold Dawson was that he never noticed. He believed power was measured in volume, in fear, in dominance. He thought the world beyond our house worked like the world inside it. He did not see that his stepdaughter, the girl he dismissed as nothing, was becoming the very thing he craved, most respected, recognized, indispensable. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. That was the secret path I had built. In one world, I was Captain Dawson, the officer trusted with strategies that altered the course of operations. In the other, I was Rachel, the quiet daughter who did not answer back. Balancing those identities nearly broke me, but I endured because I knew endurance was a weapon. And one day I also knew silence would no longer be the shield I carried. It would be the blade that ended Harold Dawson's illusion forever. The day I was promoted to captain was supposed to mark a clean division between what I had been and what I was becoming. At 28 years old, stepping into a rank that many never reached in a lifetime, I should have been allowed to breathe with pride. My superiors congratulated me in crisp voices, their handshakes firm, their eyes carrying something close to respect. But respect was never a currency I could spend at home. Harold Dawson made sure of that. He insisted the celebration take place in our own dining room. Not a hall on base, not an official gathering with speeches and formality, but within the four walls he controlled. He wanted the illusion that he presided over my achievement, that the colonel's presence was his doing, that his house was still the center of authority. Colonel Michael Granger arrived just after sunset. His posture straight, his face marked with the calm assurance of a man used to authority. His handshake was polite, but his eyes swept the room like searchlights, noting every detail, weighing every gesture. The moment he entered, the dinner shifted from family to formality. Because of his rank and his purpose in being there, the gathering became an official military event, whether Harold understood that or not. That technicality would matter later more than any of us realized. The table was dressed with dishes my mother Linda had not cooked in years. She had spent the entire day in the kitchen following Harold's barked orders to prepare a menu fit for admiration. Her hands trembled as she carried the platters, but she forced a smile that never reached her eyes. She glanced at me once, an apology hidden in her expression, as though she already feared what might happen when Harold's performance began to unravel. Harold himself had ironed his old uniform, even though he no longer had the right to wear it. The fabric stretched uncomfortably across his stomach, the shine of metals dulled but still pinned as if they could conjure the past. He straightened when the colonel stepped inside, laughter spilling from him too loudly, his handshake too firm, his voice just a pitch too high. He wanted to dominate the room, to remind everyone that once he had worn the same cloth. But Colonel Granger's face remained neutral, neither impressed nor dismissive, just watchful. That neutrality was lethal to Harold. He thrived on reaction, and when none came, his stories grew louder. Throughout dinner, he launched into embellished tales of campaigns he had never truly commanded. He spoke of troops that never served under him, victories that had belonged to others, setbacks that he blamed on politics rather than his own failures. My mother tried once to add detail, a small correction about a date, but he cut her off sharply, his voice slamming down like a gavel. She fell silent. I kept my eyes on my plate, chewing slowly, stretching each bite to delay the inevitable moment when he might turn attention toward me. Years of experience had taught me that invisibility was safest. But invisibility does not last forever. Colonel Granger had been listening with patience that bordered on disinterest. His fork moved methodically, his posture unchanging. And then, without warning, his gaze shifted toward me. His voice, calm but edged with curiosity, broke the rhythm of Harold's monologue. "And you, Miss Dawson, what is it that you do?" The air tightened. My pulse quickened. I opened my mouth to answer, but Harold was faster. "She is just a girl with books," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Always hiding in corners, nose buried where it does not belong. Nothing worth boring you with, Colonel." He laughed, a brittle sound that carried the edge of warning meant for me. "Do not speak. Do not reveal. Stay silent." But the colonel did not laugh. He leaned back slightly, his eyes still locked on me, his expression unreadable but sharp. "Books are rarely boring," he said. "What kind of books?" His words carried weight, pressing against the walls I had built around my double life. If I lied, I would confirm Harold's narrative. If I told the truth, I risked exposure. I lowered my eyes and answered softly. "Mostly history, strategy. Old campaigns." Harold forced a laugh again, louder this time. "See just a little mouse chasing fairy tales," he said, his tone both mocking and defensive. But the colonel's eyes narrowed. His head tilted the smallest shift that signaled recognition. This was not idle curiosity. He knew something. Perhaps he had seen the name R. Dawson on simulation reports, the signature attached to solutions that had startled even seasoned officers. Perhaps he had already suspected the quiet young woman at the table was more than she appeared. The moment was delicate. The colonel asked another question sharper, now one that cut through Harold's bluster. "Have you ever worked with simulations, Miss Dawson?" The word itself was a trigger. Harold stiffened beside me, his hand tightening around his fork. The mention of simulations carried weight because only those involved in high-level tactical work understood their significance. He could not allow that conversation to continue. He needed control back. His laugh cracked at the edges as he barked out, "Do not mind her, Colonel. She would not know a simulation from a bedtime story. She reads to escape reality, nothing more." He waved a hand again, dismissive, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. He was losing ground. The colonel did not look away from me. He waited silence, stretching like a wire pulled taut. In that silence, everything I had hidden pressed at the edges. For years, I had balanced brilliance and invisibility. For years, I had allowed Harold to believe silence meant surrender, but the colonel's eyes said otherwise. He saw through it. He recognized me. Harold sensed it too. Recognition threatened him more than anything. He could live with indifference, but not with exposure. His authority at this table, the fragile dominance he had built on fear, was collapsing. And when Harold felt threatened, he struck. He slammed his fork down the metal, clattering against the plate, and in the next breath, his hand moved faster than thought. His fist drove across the table toward me, carrying years of resentment, fear, and rage. The blow landed against my chest with a sickening crack, ribs folding inward. The sound echoed through the dining room, a violent punctuation at the end of his failing performance. My fork slipped clattering to the floor. Wine spilled across the tablecloth, staining it dark red. Silence followed, heavier than the strike itself. My mother gasped once, then pressed her lips closed as if swallowing the noise back into her chest. Harold leaned back, smirk curling again, believing the matter settled. To him, violence was final. But in that moment, as pain seared through my chest, I saw the colonel's expression shift. Not shock, not outrage, but recognition confirmed. That dinner staged for Harold's pride had turned into something else entirely. It was no longer his stage. It was a tribunal, and the verdict had already begun to fall. The silence after the blow was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of recognition, the kind that settles when truth is no longer avoidable. My ribs screamed with every shallow breath, pain burning deep in my chest, but I kept my spine straight. I had trained myself for this very posture. Bend and you invite more. Break and you surrender ground. So I did neither. I sat still, eyes fixed not on Harold, but on the rim of my glass, watching the red wine slide down in slow streaks, as though the table itself was bleeding. Harold leaned back in his chair with the smugness of a man who believed he had reclaimed authority. In his mind, the strike had reset the hierarchy, reminded everyone who controlled the room. My mother's hands trembled against her napkin, twisting it tighter and tighter until it was no more than a damp knot between her fingers. She did not look at me. She never did. For years, she had measured safety by how little she noticed how quickly she could disappear inside her own silence. Colonel Granger's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His face did not shift into outrage or disgust. Instead, he blinked slowly, a deliberate movement that carried more weight than shouting ever could. His gaze moved from Harold to me, studying, connecting, confirming. He had suspected already. Now the evidence was undeniable. Harold cleared his throat, eager to move past what he had just done. He muttered about discipline, about how children these days needed correction, his voice cracking under the strain of its own lie. He laughed again, brittle and empty, and reached for the bottle of wine. The liquid sloshed onto the table as he poured, though his glass was nearly full. His smirk returned, but it wavered at the edges. The colonel placed his fork down with quiet precision, the soft clink against porcelain sharper than any shout. His voice cut through the air with steel. "You just assaulted a United States captain at an official military event." His tone did not rise yet. It carried the authority of command that had broken men on battlefields. She is already a captain on track to Admiral. Arrest him." The words cracked the air like thunder. The front door opened at once and 2 military police officers stepped inside. Their boots struck the floor in unison, their presence no accident. The colonel had ordered them to wait outside before dinner even began, aware that Harold's temper might turn the evening into something darker. They moved with practiced precision, stepping to either side of Harold's chair. For the first time, Harold's smirk faltered. His hand froze halfway to his glass. His eyes darted toward the colonel, then to me, then back again. "This is my house!" He barked, his voice too loud, too desperate. "You have no right. She is nothing." His words carried the same bluster that had kept our household silent for years, but now they fell flat. Authority radiated from the colonel, and it dwarfed Harold's false bravado. The MPs leaned in firm hands, locking on Harold's arms. He thrashed once, clumsy more out of panic than strength. The chair scraped against the floor. My mother cried out softly but stayed seated, her body caught between fear and relief. Harold's face twisted, red blotches spreading across his skin as the realization sank in. He had lost the room. He had lost the narrative. He had lost control. I pressed a hand lightly to my chest, the heat of broken ribs reminding me of where I was. The pain was sharp, but beneath it pulsed something new: anticipation. For years, Harold had believed silence was his shield. But tonight, silence betrayed him. The colonel's words carried more weight than any strike Harold could deliver. The very presence of the MPs shattered the illusion Harold had depended on. He shouted again, "You cannot do this. This is my family, my house, my rules." His voice cracked mid-sentence, the pitch rising not with power but with fear. The colonel did not flinch. His gaze locked on Harold, his tone quiet but absolute. "You struck a U.S. officer in front of witnesses at a sanctioned event, and you think that goes unnoticed. You disgraced your oath, your uniform, and the very code you claim to live by. That ends now." Harold's eyes darted toward my mother, desperate for her to speak to shield him. But Linda lowered her gaze. For once, she did not intervene. Her silence this time did not protect him. It condemned him. The MPs pulled Harold to his feet. He twisted spitting words toward me. "You! This is your doing." His voice cracked ragged with fury and disbelief. For years he had told himself I was invisible. Now the truth had pierced him. I was the reason he stood exposed, humiliated, restrained. I did not answer. My silence was no longer his tool. It was mine. As they dragged him toward the door, he shouted one last desperate protest. "You are making a mistake. She is nothing. She always has been." The colonel rose fully from his chair, his stance radiating authority that needed no weapon. "You have no idea who sits at your table," he said, his words like a verdict. His gaze shifted briefly toward me, not pity, not even sympathy, but recognition and respect. Then back to Harold. "You will face the law." The MPs tightened their grip. Harold struggled once more, but the fight drained from him quickly. He had built his power on intimidation, and in the face of true authority, he had nothing left. They hauled him toward the open door. My mother's hands covered her face. Tears slipped between her fingers. I remained still, every breath cutting into my ribs, but my eyes locked on Harold as he was dragged away. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in him. Not the rage-filled fear he wielded against us, but the hollow fear of a man who realized his reign had ended. The door slammed shut behind them. The house seemed to exhale the air, thinner, cleaner. The table, once his throne, now looked bare, stripped of the illusion he had clung to. The colonel's eyes stayed on me, steady, calculating. My chest ached, but inside something deeper stirred. The moment I had long imagined but never thought possible had arrived. Harold Dawson was no longer untouchable. The silence he demanded had shattered, and in its place rose the truth, a truth that would carry consequences he could never escape. The slam of the front door echoed through the house like the final chord of a verdict. My chest still throbbed, each breath jagged, but I did not flinch. I wanted to remember the sound. For years, doors had slammed in anger, in threats, in fear. This time the slam meant something else. It meant Harold Dawson was no longer in control. The two military police officers held him between them, one on each arm, their grips steady. He twisted once more, trying to shake free, but his movements were sloppy, fueled by panic rather than strength. His voice cracked as he shouted, "You cannot take me out like this, not from my own house!" His protests ricocheted against walls that had heard so many of his rants, but the words no longer carried power. The colonel stood with quiet authority. He did not need to raise his voice. Every syllable he spoke was sharpened by command. "This is no longer your house in spirit," he said, "because you forfeited that the moment you struck her. You assaulted a United States captain. That makes this an official matter." Harold tried to laugh, but it came out brittle, fractured by desperation. "A captain," he sneered, his tone high-pitched. "She is nothing more than a child, a mouse with books." The colonel did not look at him. He looked at me. His eyes carried recognition that could not be erased. "She is Captain Dawson, Naval Intelligence, on track to Admiral. You struck the wrong person at the wrong time, and now you will answer for it." My mother, still seated, let out a sound that was half sob, half exhale. She pressed her napkin against her face, muffling her grief. For years, she had tried to keep peace through silence, but tonight, silence condemned him instead of protecting him. She did not move to stop the MPs. She did not plead. She wept quietly, but she let them do their work. Harold's heels dragged against the wooden floor as the MPs pulled him toward the porch. His eyes darted wildly, searching for support, for rescue. He found none. Neighbors had gathered outside, drawn by the noise, by the flash of uniforms, by the commanding presence of a colonel leading an arrest. Curtains twitched. Porch lights flickered on. The quiet suburban street had become a stage, and Harold Dawson, once the man who strutted with false authority, was now the spectacle of disgrace. He fought harder as the MPs pulled him out the front door, his voice breaking into a shriek. "This is my neighborhood, my reputation, my life. You cannot parade me like this." But that was exactly what was happening. His power had thrived in the shadows, in the privacy of a house where silence reigned. Now the light of exposure stripped him bare. The colonel stepped outside after them, his voice calm, but carrying enough force for every onlooker to hear. He disgraced his oath. He struck a captain. He is under arrest by military authority. The words rolled across the lawn, undeniable, final. The MPs pressed Harold against the side of the military vehicle waiting at the curb. The sound of metal cuffs snapping shut around his wrists silenced even the murmurs of the crowd. Harold's face twisted rage and humiliation, battling for dominance, but the fear beneath it betrayed him. He spat words toward me as they secured him. "This is your doing." "You set me up." His voice was ragged, broken. For years he had treated me as invisible. Now he screamed my name like I was the center of his ruin. I did not answer. My silence was stronger than anything I could have spoken. The neighbors stared. Some whispered, others shook their heads. They had known Harold as a loud man, a braggart, perhaps difficult, but few had seen the side that lived within our walls. Now they saw him restrained, caged by authority that would not bend. My mother stepped onto the porch, tears still staining her cheeks, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. She said nothing, but her presence spoke volumes. For once, she did not shield him. The colonel approached the vehicle, his figure tall, unshaken. He leaned close enough for Harold to hear clearly. "You disgraced not only yourself, but every man and woman who ever wore the uniform. Your career ends tonight. Your freedom ends tonight." His words were cold, deliberate. Harold lunged once more against the MPs, shouting incoherently, but his struggle was pathetic, now drained of the dominance he had once wielded. Inside the house, I sat in my chair, hands folded over my chest, where the pain pulsed with each heartbeat. I listened to the sounds outside the vehicle door slamming shut, the rumble of the engine, the diminishing noise of Harold's shouting as he was driven away. The silence that followed was heavy but different from any silence that had lived in that house before. It was not fear. It was absence. Absence of his voice, his orders, his rage. The walls seemed to settle the air cleaner, the space wider. The colonel returned to the dining room, his posture unchanged. He glanced at my mother, who had sunk into a chair, her shoulders shaking. Then he looked at me. His gaze was steady, not pitying, not sympathetic, but acknowledging. He saw me not as a victim, but as an officer, as someone who had endured and was still standing. That recognition carried more weight than I could put into words. The roast sat untouched on the table, the plates cooling, the glasses half full. The dinner had been meant to celebrate, but it had transformed into exposure, into reckoning. My ribs ached with every breath, yet inside me something stronger had taken root. For years I had endured quietly, telling myself survival was enough. But survival was no longer the only language I spoke. Tonight had revealed something else. Tonight had shown me that endurance, when met with recognition, can ignite into consequence. The colonel finally spoke, his voice low, but final. "The law will handle him now. He will not return here." My mother sobbed harder, the words both a relief and a shock. She had lived so long waiting for doors to slam again, for his footsteps to thunder down the hall, that imagining a life without him felt unreal. But it was real. For the first time in decades, Harold Dawson was gone, not by chance, not by silence, but by justice. As the MPs drove him away, I felt the weight shift inside me. The battle I had fought in silence for years had broken open into the light. Harold's downfall had not come from fists or shouting. It had come from exposure, from recognition, from the very authority he had spent his life chasing but never earned. And though my chest burned with pain, my spirit stood taller than it ever had. Harold Dawson had been paraded out of his own home, disgraced before neighbors, stripped of the silence that had protected him. And this was only the beginning. His arrest was not the end of the story. It was the first chapter of consequence. The night Harold was taken away should have ended with relief, but pain has its own memory, and mine lived inside my chest. In the hospital room, the fluorescent lights hummed with steady indifference as doctors wrapped my ribs in tight bands and spoke in calm, clinical tones. Fractured, they said. Time and rest would heal them. They gave me medication for the pain, but nothing for the memories that surged when the room grew quiet. Every breath pulled me back, not only to the moment his fist shattered bone, but to the long chain of blows, words, and silences that had preceded it. At 17, I remembered being thrown into a wall because I had questioned where my mother was. The drywall cracked, leaving a dent that stayed until we moved years later, a silent mark that no one outside the family ever noticed. At 19, I remembered the night he broke my nose. He said I had looked at him wrong, that my silence was disrespect, that my eyes carried rebellion he would not tolerate. Blood had poured down my face, staining the carpet, and my mother had whispered apologies while pressing towels against me, as though her whispers could erase the damage. He never apologized. He never even looked back. The phrases returned with each shallow breath. "You'll never be anything. You'll never survive without me. No one will believe you." Each word had been another lash, another invisible scar. I had learned to wear silence like armor, to endure each strike by refusing him the reaction he craved. My stillness drove him to strike harder, but it also preserved me. If I could hold the line without breaking, then somewhere deep inside I would remain untouched. That was the calculus of survival. As I lay in the hospital bed, bandages tied around my chest, I realized endurance had become more than a tool. It had shaped the way I thought, the way I saw the world. When instructors placed complex simulations in front of me, I did not panic. I waited. I studied the chaos until patterns revealed themselves. I had been trained not by textbooks, but by years of anticipating Harold's next move, reading the flicker of his eyes, the sharp intake of breath before the storm. Anticipation had saved me at home, and it had elevated me in the Navy. It was survival stretched into brilliance. But endurance comes at a cost. Nights in the barracks, when other officers slept easily after drills, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, unable to release the vigilance drilled into me since childhood. Every sound was a warning, every silence a test. I never felt safe enough to let go. My journals filled with diagrams, map strategies, but also with fragments of memory I could not silence. I told myself they were notes, but they were confessions. The truth is, I did not know if endurance had made me strong or if it had simply hardened me. In the hospital, the colonel visited once. He stood at the foot of my bed, posture as straight as always, his expression composed. He did not offer pity. He did not offer comfort. Instead, he said quietly, "You held your composure. Even when struck, you did not break." His words were not praise, but recognition. He saw what I had carried, what I had endured. In his voice, I heard confirmation of what I had long suspected, that the silence I thought had hidden me had in fact revealed me. After he left, my mother came. She sat in the chair beside my bed, her hands clutching her purse as though it could keep her steady. She cried softly, whispering, "I should have stopped him. All these years, I should have done more." I looked at her, and though pain lanced through my ribs, my voice was calm. "You survived." That was enough. She shook her head, tears falling, but I believed the words. She had carried her own scars invisible but deep, and her survival had allowed me to build mine. Endurance was not glamorous. It was not the kind of victory that drew applause. It was sitting through hours of anger without blinking. It was waiting for storms to pass without running. It was learning that silence could be a weapon sharper than any shout. My ribs would heal, but the deeper endurance would remain etched into the very structure of who I was. As I lay there, I understood something new. Survival had always been reactive, a way to outlast Harold's cruelty. But now survival had become proactive. It had carried me to a rank I had never dreamed of at 17. It had placed me in rooms where admirals leaned over my diagrams. It had given me the discipline to see patterns where others saw chaos. And now, with Harold gone, survival was evolving again. Endurance was no longer about hiding. It was about preparing for what came next. Because Harold's arrest was not the end. It was the beginning. He would face trial. He would lose the benefits he clung to. He would lose the uniform he paraded like armor. But his shadow still lingered. I could feel it in the way my mother flinched at sudden noises, in the way I checked every door twice before sleeping. Trauma does not vanish with an arrest. It echoes. It waits. It builds. I promised myself as I traced the bruises spreading across my ribs that I would not let endurance be the only story. The next chapter would not just be about surviving Harold. It would be about dismantling the power he thought he held forever. The pain in my chest was sharp, but beneath it burned resolve. For years I had whispered to myself, "Endure, anticipate, do not break." Now I whispered something else. Endure, yes, but also expose, also fight, also win. The doctors discharged me after several days. My movements stiff, my breaths shallow. I stepped out of the hospital into sunlight that felt harsher than I remembered. My mother walked beside me, small and quiet, but for the first time in years, there was no man's shadow towering over us. It was just us walking forward. The silence felt different, not oppressive, not waiting for a storm. It felt open, like the pause before something new. I carried the pain with me, but I carried something sharper too, the knowledge that endurance had kept me alive, but now it would help me take everything Harold had built on fear and tear it down piece by piece. The weeks between Harold's arrest and his trial moved slowly each day, thick with anticipation. My ribs healed enough for me to walk with less pain, but every deep breath reminded me of the fracture, as though my body insisted I never forget what had been done. Outside the walls of the hospital and my mother's quiet house, the Navy moved quickly. Colonel Granger had filed his report the very night Harold was taken away, and his words carried the weight of law. Harold Dawson had not only struck his stepdaughter, he had assaulted a serving United States captain in the presence of superior officers at an event deemed official by military protocol. That distinction mattered more than anything. It meant Harold's actions fell under military jurisdiction. It meant he would not escape behind the excuse of domestic privacy. When the day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was stark, the walls lined with flags, the bench filled by stern faces in uniform. Harold sat at the defendant's table, his wrists free for the proceeding, but his posture heavy, his uniform ill-fitting now that it carried no honor. He had insisted on wearing it as though the fabric itself could shield him, but stripped of authority, the medals looked like trinkets pinned to desperation. He avoided my gaze as I entered, his eyes darting from his attorney to the gallery where neighbors and officers sat whispering. He had spent his life fearing exposure, and now exposure was all he had. The prosecutor began by outlining the charges: assault of a superior officer, conduct unbecoming, disgrace of uniform and oath. The words landed like hammer strikes. The evidence was plain: Colonel Granger's testimony, the MP's reports, the medical records showing my fractured ribs. I sat in the witness chair, back straight, voice steady as I recounted the night. I did not embellish. I did not add drama. I spoke with the calm precision the Navy had trained into me. I told them how Harold struck me, how my mother froze, how the colonel issued his command. My ribs ached as I described the pain, but my voice never wavered. Harold's defense was weak. He claimed it was discipline that I had provoked him, that families had their own ways of handling conflict. His words faltered under the weight of uniformed officers staring back at him unimpressed. His attorney tried to paint me as defiant, as disrespectful as someone who had challenged him in his own house. But each question unraveled in the face of testimony from the colonel and the MPs. Their authority outstripped Harold's excuses. When Colonel Granger took the stand, his words were measured and lethal. He described Harold's arrogance, his lies at the table, the sudden strike, and the undeniable reality that it was delivered to a decorated officer during an official event. His voice never rose yet. It carried the weight of judgment sharper than any shout. The gallery listened in silence. I saw neighbors there, faces pale with realization, perhaps remembering every time they had heard shouting through our walls, but told themselves it was not their concern. Now it was concern enough for a courtroom. My mother sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered but her body rigid. She wept quietly when the colonel confirmed that Harold had disgraced not only his family but the service itself. The judge delivered the verdict after deliberation that lasted less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Harold Dawson, once an officer, was sentenced to confinement, stripped of every veteran benefit he had leaned on, dishonorably discharged from even the memory of service. The gavel struck, and with it shattered the last illusion Harold had built. He was no longer a retired officer. He was a disgraced man in custody. Harold erupted when the sentence was read. He stood his chair, scraping loudly, his voice rising in a desperate shout. "This is a lie! She set me up. She poisoned you all against me. She is nothing!" His face flushed, veins straining against his neck, his body jerking forward as though he could still intimidate the room. But the MPs moved in swiftly, holding him back, pressing him down until the outburst collapsed into incoherent muttering. The spectacle of his breakdown only deepened the weight of the verdict. He looked not like a man cheated, but like a man exposed. I did not move from my seat. I watched him shout, watched him thrash, and I felt no need to respond. For years, I had imagined the moment when Harold might finally face consequences. I thought I might feel triumph or anger or release. Instead, I felt clarity. Justice was not about feeling good. It was about truth standing where lies had reigned. It was about the silence that had protected him finally turning against him. After the sentencing, reporters wrote headlines that cut Harold's name into pieces. Retired officer convicted of assaulting captain. Benefits revoked. Family violence exposed. His disgrace spread through the very circles he had once craved to impress. Men he had called friends avoided his name. Superiors who had tolerated his bitterness now spoke of him only in tones of contempt. His career ended not in retirement honors, but in humiliation. My mother and I walked out of the courtroom together. The sun was sharp overhead, the air dry, the sound of traffic normal, as though the world had not just witnessed the dismantling of a man who had ruled our lives for over a decade. My mother stopped on the steps, her body trembling, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But then she looked at me, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying, and she whispered, "Is it really over?" I placed a hand gently on her arm, my ribs aching with the movement, and answered, "It is over for him. For us, it is just beginning." She nodded faintly, her lips pressing together as though she did not fully believe me but wanted to. Survival had taught her to doubt permanence. Endings never came clean. Yet in that moment on those courthouse steps, there was space enough for possibility. That night, I sat at my desk in uniform, the weight of the captain's bars heavy on my shoulders, but grounding. I opened my journal, the same one where for years I had sketched maps and strategies in silence. This time, I wrote not of tactics, but of truth. I wrote the words I could never say to Harold while he ruled our house. You thought silence meant surrender, but silence was how I trained to outlast you. You thought fear meant control, but fear built the patience that defeated you. Every strike forged my endurance, and endurance became the weapon you never saw. Harold's trial was not only his downfall, it was the exposure of a truth larger than him, that even in the face of violence, of silence, of dismissal, endurance can carve its way into justice. He had believed himself untouchable. Now he was caged by the very authority he once sought to wield, and for the first time in my life, I walked through my own front door without the weight of his presence. The house was the same, but the air was different. Clean, open, waiting. In the weeks after Harold's sentencing, the house felt like a stranger to us. It had been built into a cage over the years, each room echoing with the memory of his footsteps, his voice, his orders. Without him, the silence was strange at first, sharp and hollow. My mother Linda moved through the halls as though she expected him to return at any moment. She startled at the sound of the phone ringing, paused when the floor creaked, and often looked toward the door as though he might walk in and undo everything. Survival had conditioned her too deeply for freedom to arrive easily. For as long as I could remember, Linda had been defined by endurance of her own. She had learned to keep her head low, her voice quiet, her hands busy. In Harold's presence, she had perfected invisibility, wearing compliance like armor. She cooked, cleaned, smiled when told, and swallowed her protests whole. I had often resented her silence, mistaking it for weakness. But sitting beside her now, watching her navigate a world without him, I understood better. Her silence had been its own kind of survival, one that allowed her to make it through years that might have broken her completely. The first sign of change came one morning, a few days after Harold was sent away. I found her standing by the kitchen window, a watering can in her hand, gently feeding the row of potted plants she had neglected for years. She hummed softly a faint tune I had not heard since childhood. The sound was fragile, almost embarrassed, as though it might break if spoken too loudly. I stood in the doorway, saying nothing, just listening. That soft hum carried more power than any declaration. It was proof that life was stirring again in her. Still, freedom did not arrive without guilt. Linda often sat at the table in the evenings, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, gone cold, her eyes far away. Sometimes she whispered, "I should have stopped him. I should have protected you." I sat beside her, my ribs still sore but healing, and told her, "You survived." That was enough. She shook her head, tears wetting her cheeks, but I repeated it until she finally nodded, even if she did not believe it fully yet. Survival is not weakness. Survival is defiance in its own way. Slowly, she began to reclaim pieces of herself. She pulled old photo albums from the closet, dusting them off as though she had not dared to open them while Harold was in the house. She flipped through pictures of me as a child of my father before he was killed in combat, of a family that existed before Harold's shadow. She smiled faintly at the images, her fingertips brushing over them like fragile treasures. One evening, she placed a picture of my father on the mantel, a small act of remembrance she had not dared attempt while Harold lived here. I watched her do it, and I saw in her face both grief and courage. Freedom also carried fear. She worried constantly about Harold's return, about letters he might send, about neighbors gossiping. Trauma does not leave easily, and for Linda it clung like smoke. But I reminded her each time Harold was gone. His benefits stripped, his uniform disgraced, his power dissolved. He was not the man who had commanded our silence. He was a prisoner living under the authority of others now, and slowly she let herself believe it. The community around us shifted too. Neighbors who had once ignored the shouting now brought by casseroles and soft apologies. They said they had not known, though I wondered if they had chosen not to. Linda accepted their offerings with polite smiles but spoke little. Forgiveness was not something she handed out freely. Yet their presence mattered. For years we had been alone in a house ruled by one man. Now, even if imperfect, we were not entirely alone. One afternoon, I returned from base to find Linda sitting on the porch with a small book in her hands. She looked up at me, eyes brighter than I had seen in years. "I used to write," she said, her voice tentative, "before all of this." I sat beside her, careful of my still healing ribs, and asked her to read. She shook her head, embarrassed, but later I found scraps of paper in the kitchen, her handwriting filling pages again. Words she had buried were beginning to return. It was not a sudden transformation. Some nights she still woke from sleep with a gasp, clutching her chest as though Harold's presence lingered in dreams. She still checked the locks twice before bed, still hesitated to speak too loudly. But each small act of freedom mattered. Each flower watered each word, written each smile that did not require permission. These were victories quiet but undeniable. For me, watching her reclaim herself carried its own emotional weight. I had hated her silence once. I had thought she abandoned me by refusing to fight. But seeing her now, I understood. She had endured in her way, and her endurance had allowed me to endure in mine. We had survived parallel battles in the same house, and now, for the first time, we could begin to live without him. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned gold, she stood beside me in the backyard. She looked at me, tears gathering in her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you for what I asked, for surviving," she said, "for being stronger than I could." I took her hand gently, my own eyes burning, and replied, "We both survived. That's enough." The words echoed what I had told her in the hospital, but this time they carried new meaning. Together, we were no longer only survivors. We were witnesses to each other's endurance. The colonel visited once more weeks after the trial. He spoke little as always, but when he looked at my mother, his expression softened. He told her that Harold would not return, that his sentence was firm, his disgrace permanent. My mother nodded, her shoulders trembling with the weight of belief. For the first time, I saw her exhale fully, as though her lungs had been waiting years to release that breath. Linda's liberation did not come with fanfare. There were no speeches, no ceremonies. It came in the simple acts of everyday life, a song hummed at the sink, a flower pot blooming, a photograph placed back on the mantel. It came in her laughter one afternoon when she burned a batch of cookies and did not cry about wasting food. It came in her willingness to speak without glancing toward a man who no longer sat at the head of the table. For me, those moments mattered more than any courtroom verdict. Harold's downfall was justice, but my mother's quiet recovery was victory. Watching her reclaim her voice, however soft, was the truest sign that the silence he had commanded was broken for good. And as I stood beside her on that porch, listening to her hum, I realized something else. My own fight had never been just mine. It had been for her, too, for both of us, for every night she had endured in silence, for every day she had swallowed her words to survive. Harold was gone, but Linda was still here. And now, finally, she was free to live. The first time I put my uniform back on after Harold's trial, I stood in front of the mirror for a long while. The captain's bars on my shoulders gleamed in the morning light, catching the edge of the sun that filtered through my window. I had worn uniforms for years, but always in secret, always concealed from Harold's eyes, as though my accomplishments were shameful. Now I stood tall, breathing shallowly through still healing ribs, and allowed myself to be seen. This time, there was no hiding. News of Harold's conviction spread quickly. Local newspapers ran headlines that named him not as a retired officer, but as a disgraced veteran stripped of benefits. They included my name as well, but not as his stepdaughter. I was Captain Rachel Dawson, Naval Intelligence, the youngest in decades to rise to such a rank. The contrast was brutal for him. Every article tied his downfall to my rise. Every whisper in military circles carried my name as the reason his arrogance had finally collapsed. At base, my return was quiet but noticed. Officers greeted me with a respect sharper than before, not out of pity but out of recognition. They had read the reports, seen the headlines, and knew what it meant to face violence at home and still rise. Some looked at me with caution, as though unsure whether to acknowledge the trial, but I met their eyes steadily. I was not ashamed. Harold's actions did not define me. My endurance, my survival, my work, those defined me. One afternoon, I was called into a briefing room where high-ranking officers gathered around a map. They turned as I entered their conversations, pausing. Admiral Reyes, a man known for his stern silence, gestured for me to sit. He placed a folder in front of me, its contents restricted, its details sharp with urgency. "We've read your earlier reports," he said, his tone level. "We want your analysis." The room waited. My ribs ached as I leaned forward, but my mind was clear. I traced patterns on the map, pointed out vulnerabilities, proposed countermeasures. As I spoke, the officers nodded, their pens moving. They listened. They deferred. When I finished, Admiral Reyes closed the folder with finality. "Proceed with her recommendations." The words carried weight. My work was not hidden anymore. It stood in the open, commanding authority. Meanwhile, Harold's letters began arriving at the house. They were scrawled in anger, his handwriting jagged, the words filled with accusation. He called me a traitor, a liar, a usurper. He begged my mother to intervene, to tell the court he had been provoked, to say it was all a misunderstanding. My mother never opened them fully. She burned them in the sink, watching the paper curl into ash. I refused to touch them. His words had no place in the life I was building. Silence was my only reply. In prison, Harold's rage festered. I heard from military contacts that other inmates, many of them veterans themselves, despised him. They called him a coward, a man who struck a captain in front of witnesses. His reputation collapsed completely. He had once believed his uniform gave him power. Now that same uniform was the reason he was targeted inside. Stripped of rank, of benefits, of respect, he was left with nothing but his own bitterness. I, on the other hand, was being written about in publications that celebrated my career. One magazine called me a rising star in naval intelligence. Another wrote about the rarity of my rank at such a young age. Reporters wanted interviews, but I declined. I was not interested in fame. My story did not need to be told in headlines. It was enough that the truth existed, enough that Harold's name now carried shame, while mine carried respect. At home, life shifted slowly. My mother began to cook meals without waiting for orders, to watch television without lowering the volume, to laugh softly at shows she once hid from Harold. One evening, as we ate dinner together, she looked at me across the table and said, "He would hate this." I asked, "What?" She smiled faintly. The sound of peace. Her words lingered in the room long after we finished eating. On base, I grew busier, entrusted with projects that tested my limits. I wrote reports, late into the night, diagrams spread across my desk. But now, when exhaustion pressed down on me, I did not feel trapped. I felt purposeful. Every strategy was not just a puzzle, but a piece of a larger proof that survival could be transformed into strength. The irony was never lost on me. Harold had always told me I would be nothing. He said I was too soft, too quiet, too bookish. Yet every quality he mocked had carried me forward. My quiet was analysis. My bookishness was strategy. My softness was endurance. And each of those had built a captain he could never have imagined. His words had tried to break me, but they had only forged me. In letters from colleagues, I received invitations to speak at academies, to mentor younger officers, to share the strategies that had set me apart. I accepted cautiously at first, standing before rows of fresh uniforms, their faces eager. I spoke not of Harold, not of violence, but of patience, of silence, as a form of strength, of the discipline to wait until the right moment. I told them endurance was not weakness, that sometimes the hardest battles were not fought with weapons, but with resilience. They listened, and I saw in their eyes the recognition that comes when truth resonates deeper than tactics. Back at home, Harold's shadow still lingered in memories. Some nights I woke with the echo of his voice in my ears, with the sharp jolt of remembering his fist. My ribs ached in the cold, a reminder of the fracture. But each morning I rose, put on my uniform, and stepped forward. The shadow remained, but it no longer defined the light. One day, as I walked across the base, a junior officer stopped me. His salute was sharp, his eyes steady. "Ma'am," he said, "I read about what happened. I just wanted to say it gives the rest of us hope." His voice was simple, earnest. I nodded once, thanking him, but inside, his words settled like a stone in still water rippling outward. Hope. That was the legacy Harold had never intended but had created anyway. In trying to destroy me, he had given me a story that could strengthen others. Back at home, my mother began volunteering at a local shelter for women. She spoke softly with them, listening more than she spoke, but her presence mattered. One evening she told me I thought my silence meant I failed you, but maybe it means I can help others now. I took her hand, squeezed it gently, and told her she was right. Her liberation was becoming not just survival, but service. And so our lives moved forward. Harold raged in prison, his letters unanswered, his reputation dissolved. I rose in uniform, my name carried in reports and strategies. My mother smiled more often, her humming filling the house. For the first time, our lives were not built around fear. They were built around resilience. Harold once said, I would never be anything. Now every salute, every briefing, every headline proved him wrong. I did not need to shout my victory. It existed in the silence he could no longer control. And that silence, at last, belonged to me. Prison is not only a place of bars and walls, it is a place of stories. They spread faster than fists, faster than threats, faster than any reputation a man tries to build for himself. Harold learned that truth the hard way. Within weeks of his sentence, word had traveled through every corridor that he had raised his hand against a U.S. captain during an official event. Veterans inside recognized my name, some from reports they had read, others from whispers about the youngest captain in naval intelligence. His story did not end with the strike he delivered to me. It ended with the revelation that he had destroyed his own standing with a single blow. In the hierarchy of prison, he was not a tough man. He was a coward. I heard from quiet channels from contacts who monitored these things that other inmates, many who had worn the uniform with honor, despised him. They mocked him, called him weak, treated him as the very opposite of what he had always pretended to be. The bruises he once gave became the bruises he carried. The silence he once demanded at our table became the silence others forced upon him. Karma had found its way into concrete halls, and it wore the shape of humiliation. Harold had thought himself untouchable. Now he was just another man stripped of illusion, remembered not for victories but for disgrace. Meanwhile, I returned fully to my duties. The Navy did not parade me around, but the recognition was there. My strategies circulated widely. My name carried weight. At briefings, commanders listened. At war games, officers followed my lead. I did not need to raise my voice. Respect was built into the quiet precision of my work. For the first time, I felt free to claim what I had always concealed. The world beyond my house knew me not as Harold's stepdaughter, not as the quiet girl in the corner, but as Captain Rachel Dawson. Yet I did not forget the shadows I had walked through to reach this point. Endurance had kept me alive, but exposure had given me justice. I began to think about others who might still be trapped where I had once been, inside homes ruled by silence, inside families where violence was hidden beneath the surface. It was not enough to stand tall in uniform. I wanted to build something that could help others stand too. So I founded a fund, small at first, dedicated to supporting service members and their families who endured domestic violence. I used my own paychecks to start it, and soon others contributed. The mission was simple. No one should have to choose between silence and survival. We provided housing for women and children, counseling for families, legal aid for those too afraid to speak. Each case that came through felt like another thread tied back to my own story, and each time I thought, this is the work Harold could never have imagined, the legacy he could never touch. The irony deepened. While Harold withered in prison clinging to his anger, I stood on podiums speaking to audiences about resilience. I never named him. I never needed to. The power was not in exposing him again, but in turning what he tried to destroy into a force for others. At one ceremony, as cameras flashed, I said, "Sometimes the first battlefield is your own home. Surviving it is the greatest victory." The words settled into the crowd heavy but hopeful. People nodded. Some wept quietly. Others stood taller. That was my message, not vengeance, not bitterness, but truth. But karma has its own way of writing the final chapters. Harold sent one last letter. I did not read it. My mother burned it like the others, but this one carried a shorter note, its envelope trembling in her hand as she dropped it into the flame. He had begged for forgiveness. He had begged for a voice for acknowledgement. His words turned to ash like everything else he had built. Forgiveness was never mine to give. Some voices deserve silence as their only reply. I later learned that his final years in prison were filled with decline. The same men who had once looked at him with a measure of respect now treated him with contempt. He became a story told in warning the officer who struck the wrong person, the man who destroyed his own future in one arrogant act. His name was erased from walls where veterans were honored, his benefits revoked, his reputation gone. He died, not with medals, but with nothing. And that was his legacy, not glory, not leadership, not honor, but disgrace. For me, the story moved differently. I continued my work, but I also built moments of peace. I walked with my mother through gardens she had once neglected. I watched her smile at flowers blooming under her care. I saw her laugh again, truly laugh for the first time in decades. That was victory. That was justice deeper than any verdict. She had been caged in silence for so long, and now she sang softly while cooking dinner. No medal could mean more than that sound. Years later, when younger officers asked me how I had risen so quickly, how I had endured, I told them the truth. Brilliance matters, yes. Discipline matters. But sometimes the hardest battle is not fought in war rooms or on seas. Sometimes it is fought at a dinner table with silence, with patience, with the refusal to break. They looked at me with wide eyes, uncertain at first, but then they nodded. They understood. I closed those conversations with a message I carried always. Power built on fear is fragile. Real power comes from endurance, from the courage to survive, until the moment truth can be spoken aloud. Harold never understood that. He thought fists were strength, that silence was weakness. But in the end, his fists destroyed him, and my silence became the blade that cut his illusion apart. When I stood at another ceremony years after his trial, I spoke one last message to those who listened. He thought he had written my future. He thought his voice was final. But the night he struck me in front of the wrong witness, he struck down his own future instead. His story ended in disgrace. Mine began in truth. That was my revenge, not rage, not anger, but truth revealed at the moment it was meant to be. The audience rose their applause sharp and steady, and in that sound I heard something Harold never did respect, earned not demanded. Recognition given not stolen. Justice delivered not avoided. Karma had written the final line of his story, and I was free to write the rest of mine. The night Harold was taken away was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a truth I had carried too long in silence. For years, I thought no one would ever see what happened behind closed doors, that the bruises would fade and the words would stay buried. But silence cannot last forever. Eventually, truth finds its way into the light. My stepfather believed power came from fists and fear that he could control a house by keeping everyone quiet. He never understood that silence can also be resistance. It can be patience. It can be a weapon. And when the right moment comes, silence speaks louder than any shout. I share my story not because it is unique, but because it is not. Too many families hide behind closed doors. Too many children grow up learning to read the danger in footsteps, in the clearing of a throat, in the shift of an expression. Too many women are told to endure, to survive quietly, to pretend nothing is wrong. I carried that burden for years, and I know many of you watching have carried it too. Maybe you are carrying it right now. To those of you who understand, I say this: survival is not weakness. Survival is defiance. Every day you wake up and keep going, you are building the strength that will one day become your voice, your freedom, your justice. Do not let anyone convince you that silence makes you less. It is the waiting ground where endurance becomes unbreakable. And when the time comes when truth has its moment, it will be your strength that changes everything. For me, that moment came at a dinner table. For you, it might come in a courtroom or in a conversation or in the simple act of saying, enough. Wherever it comes, it will matter. And when it does, remember this: those who built their power on your fear will not stand when you take it back. They will fall just as Harold did. To my fellow service members and to anyone who has ever worn the uniform, know this: violence at home is not discipline. It is not control. It is not strength. It is betrayal. Betrayal of trust, of family, of the values we claim to defend. If you see it, if you hear it, if you know it is happening, Do not stay silent. Silence protects the abuser. Truth protects the survivor. To those watching, I ask you to share your story if you can. You do not need to name names. You do not need to relive every detail. But speak your truth, even if it is just in the comments, even if it is just a single sentence. Have you ever seen someone hide abuse behind silence? Have you ever been told to endure when you deserved to be defended? Your words matter. They may be the light someone else needs to see their way out. And tell me this too. Where are you watching from? I want to know the towns and cities, the quiet kitchens, the living rooms across America and beyond where this story reaches. Because the more we see each other, the less alone we all are. My name is Rachel Dawson. I am a captain in naval intelligence. I am also a survivor. Those two truths do not cancel each other. They strengthen each other. My story is not about a man who thought he had control. It is about the woman who endured until the day control shattered. And if my story proves anything, it is this: justice may take time, but it comes. So let this be the closing note. Violence cannot be hidden forever. Silence cannot last forever. And no matter how powerful someone believes they are, the truth will rise. When it does, it will not only end their story, it will begin yours.